She was left for dead by settlers until a young Apache found the silent widow who'd given up. A story in 6 chapters. Nari. Chapter 1. The Silence That Speaks. The Oregon Territory, 1852. The sun hung merciless above the endless expanse of sagebrush and red dirt, its heat pressing down like a weight that could crush souls. Margaret Whitmore had stopped counting the hours since she'd last spoken. What was the point? Words had become as useless as the tattered dress that clung to her skeletal frame, as meaningless as the promises her husband had made before the fever took him 3 months ago. She dragged herself forward, one bloodied knee after another, across the unforgiving ground. The wagon train had left her behind 2 days ago, or was it 3? Time blurred like the horizon in the desert heat. Dead weight. She'd heard them whisper. She ain't spoke a word since Thomas died. Gone mad with grief she has. Margaret's fingers, cracked and bleeding, clutched at the small wooden cross that hung from her neck, the only thing she had left of her former life in Missouri. The life where she'd been a school teacher, where children had once looked up to her with bright eyes, where she'd had a voice that mattered. That woman felt like a stranger now. The buzzards circled overhead, patient as death itself. They knew what she knew, that this was the end of everything. Her lips, split and dry as old leather, hadn't tasted water in over a day. Her body was giving up, cell by cell, breath by breath. As consciousness began to fade, Margaret closed her eyes and let herself remember Thomas's last words. "Find your voice again, Maggie. Don't let them steal that from you too." But there was no voice left to find. Only silence, only the approaching darkness. Chapter 2. The one who sees beyond scars. Ayana had been tracking the buzzards for half a day when he found her. The young Apache warrior, barely 22 summers old, had left his band's camp before dawn, seeking the solitude that came with hunting alone. His people called him Ayana, eternal blossom, but he felt more like a withered branch, broken off from the tree of his heritage. The white settlers had taken his sister 2 years ago during a raid. Not killed, taken, sold, his grandfather had said with eyes full of ancient pain. The not knowing gnawed at Ayana worse than any physical wound. Every pale face he encountered carried the possibility of information, of hope, of devastating confirmation. But this woman lying motionless in the dirt wasn't a threat. She was barely alive. Ayana approached cautiously, reading the signs the desert had written around her collapsed form. Wagon track, days old, boot prints of many men, heading east. One set of smaller prints, hers, leading away from the trail to this desolate place. They had abandoned her, left her to die like a lame horse. He knelt beside her, noting the way her fingers still clutched the small cross, the way her body had curled protectively around something precious. Her face was a map of suffering, sunburned, hollow-cheeked, aged beyond her years. But her breathing, though shallow, was steady. "Grandmother always said the desert tests us all," he murmured in Apache, his voice rusty from disuse. "Some it breaks, others it teaches to survive." Ayana studied her torn dress, the quality of the fabric beneath the dust and stains. This had been a woman of some standing once. Education, maybe. The way her hands were positioned, even in unconsciousness, suggested someone who had once held books, who had written letters. He made his decision quickly. The band would not approve. His people had learned to distrust all whites, and for good reason. But Ayana had always been different, had always seen beyond the surface of things. And something in this woman's absolute stillness, her complete surrender to fate, reminded him of his own dark nights when the grief for his lost sister had nearly consumed him. Lifting her carefully, he felt how light she had become, how her body had already begun the process of returning to the earth, but her heart still beat. Her spirit, however damaged, still flickered. "You're not alone now," he whispered, knowing she couldn't hear him. "Not anymore." Chapter 3. The language of broken things. Margaret's return to consciousness was gradual, like surfacing from deep water. The first thing she noticed was the absence of pain, not complete, but muted, manageable. The second was the smell of sage and something else, something medicinal and earthy. The third was the sound of quiet movements, careful and deliberate. She opened her eyes to find herself in a small shelter made of branches and animal hides, cool and dim. Her body was covered with soft furs, and she could feel the pull of bandages on her knees and hands. Someone had tended her wounds, had given her water. She could taste it still on her lips, sweet and clean. A shadow moved near the entrance, and Margaret's body tensed with instinctive fear. But when the figure stepped into the filtered light, she saw it was a young man, Apache by his dress and bearing, with kind eyes that seemed to hold their own burden of sadness. Ayana paused when he saw she was awake, his hands full of the herbs he'd been gathering. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two damaged souls recognizing something familiar in the other's pain. "You're safe," he said quietly in English, his accent thick but his words clear. "I'm not going to hurt you." Margaret tried to speak, to thank him, but no sound came. Her throat felt closed, sealed by months of silence and grief. She touched her throat, frustrated, and saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "The words are gone," he said, not a question, but a statement of fact. "I know. Sometimes the heart breaks so completely that it takes the voice with it." He set down his herbs and approached slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. "My name is Ayana. I found you in the desert. You were—" He paused, searching for words. "You were ready to join the spirits." Margaret nodded, tears starting to flow. She had been ready. She had wanted the pain to end. But here she was, alive, cared for by someone who should have been her enemy according to everything she'd been taught. "Your people," she finally managed to whisper, the words like sand in her throat. "They'll come looking." Ayana shook his head. "No, I told them I was hunting alone. They don't know about you." He studied her face carefully. "Do you want me to take you back to the wagon route? Try to find your people?" The question hung in the air between them. Margaret thought of the faces that had looked at her with pity and disgust, of the whispered conversations about her madness, of the way they'd left her behind, like discarded baggage. "They're not my people," she whispered. "Not anymore." Something shifted in Ayana's expression, a recognition of shared exile. "Then you understand," he said softly, "what it means to be alone among your own kind." In the days that followed, they developed a strange, gentle rhythm. Ayana would hunt and gather while Margaret slowly regained her strength. They communicated as much through gesture and expression as through word. He because English was his second language, she because her voice remained fragile, unreliable. He taught her which plants were safe to eat, how to read the desert's moods, how to find water in the most unlikely places. She, in turn, began to help with small tasks, mending his clothes with careful stitches, organizing his few possessions with the instinctive order of someone who had once managed a classroom. Neither spoke of their past, but it lived in the space between them, a shared understanding of loss that needed no words. Chapter 4. The Healing Between Worlds. 3 weeks into their unlikely companionship, Margaret finally found her voice again, not through words but through tears. It happened while she was helping Ayana prepare a meal, her hands working automatically to clean the roots he'd gathered. The simple domesticity of it, the quiet companionship, suddenly overwhelmed her with memories of everything she'd lost. Thomas had loved her cooking. He'd always said she had the gentlest hands, that she could coax flavor from the simplest ingredients. Their small cabin in Missouri had been filled with laughter and plans for the future. Children they'd never have, a life they'd never build. The sobs came without warning, raw and violent, shaking her thin frame. Ayana was beside her in an instant, not trying to stop her tears, but simply sitting with her, his presence steady and calm. "Tell me," he said softly when her sobs began to subside. "Tell me who you were before." And somehow, in that shelter made of branches and hope, Margaret began to speak. Haltingly at first, then with growing strength, she told him about Thomas, about their dreams of Oregon, about the fever that had taken him, and the way the other settlers had looked at her afterward, as if grief itself was contagious. "They said I was mad," she whispered, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Maybe I was. When Thomas died, I felt like I died too, like there was nothing left of me worth saving." Ayana listened without judgment, his dark eyes reflecting understanding. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "My sister," he said finally, "Nijoni. She was taken 2 years ago, sold to white men as a slave. Every day I wake up not knowing if she's alive or dead, if she's being hurt, if she remembers our mother's songs." Margaret felt the weight of his pain, recognized it as a mirror of her own. "Is that why you saved me? Because you couldn't save her?" Maybe, he admitted, or maybe because I saw in you what I feel in myself, someone who lost everything that mattered. They sat in comfortable silence, two broken people finding solace in shared understanding. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the sage, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. "What will you do?" Margaret asked eventually. "About your sister?" Ayana's jaw tightened. "I don't know. The trail is cold. She could be anywhere from California to Mexico. My people think she's dead, that I should let her go, but I can't. Not while there's still hope." Margaret studied his face, seeing the determination beneath the pain. "Then don't let them convince you to give up hope. Hope is sometimes all we have." It was the first time in months that she'd felt anything beyond her own grief. The first time she'd offered comfort instead of needing it. The realization was both frightening and liberating. That night, as they lay on opposite sides of the small fire, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. "Ayana," she said into the darkness, "I want to help you find her." Chapter 5. The choice that changes everything. The proposal hung in the air between them, like smoke from their small fire. Ayana turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You don't know what you're saying," he said quietly. "The search could take years. The dangers," he paused, considering. "And I'm Apache. If we're seen together, they'll assume you're my captive, or worse." Margaret had thought of this, had spent hours considering the implications. "I know, but I also know that I can't go back to the world I came from. Those people who left me to die, they represent everything I used to be. A woman who needed protecting, who couldn't survive on her own, who was only valuable as long as she had a man to define her." She sat up, her voice growing stronger. "You saved my life, Ayana. More than that, you helped me find my voice again. Now I want to use it for something that matters. And if we find her? If we find Nijoni? What then? Then we find a way to bring her home, or we help her build a new home wherever she wants it to be." Margaret met his eyes across the fire. "I was a teacher once. I know how to read and write, how to navigate the white world. You know how to survive in the wilderness, how to track, how to fight. Together, we might actually have a chance." Ayana was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. Margaret could almost see him weighing the possibilities, calculating the risks. "My people won't understand," he said finally. "They'll think I've betrayed them by trusting a white woman. And my people already think I'm dead or mad. We'll be outcasts in both worlds." "Yes." He looked at her again, and she saw something new in his expression. Not just pain and determination, but a glimmer of hope. "But maybe that's exactly what we need to be." The next morning, they began to plan. Ayana had heard rumors, fragments of information gathered from other Apache bands, about white settlements where captured natives were sold. Margaret contributed her knowledge of how such transactions might be documented, where records might be kept. "There's a man," Ayana said, sketching a rough map in the dirt. "A trader named Carlson. He operates out of a settlement called Broken Rock, about 2 weeks' ride south. He's known to deal in human cargo." Margaret felt her stomach turn, but she kept her voice steady. "Then that's where we start." They spent the day preparing for the journey, gathering supplies and planning their story. Margaret would pose as Ayana's captive, a white woman being sold by her Apache captor. It was a dangerous deception, but it was the only way they could move through the territories without arousing immediate suspicion. As they prepared to leave their shelter, Margaret felt a pang of loss. This small haven had been where she'd found herself again, where she'd rediscovered her voice and her purpose, but it was also where she'd learned that healing sometimes meant letting go of who you used to be. "Are you ready?" Ayana asked, securing the last of their supplies to his horse. Margaret looked back at the shelter one last time, then at the man who had become her unlikely partner in both survival and purpose. "I'm ready." As they rode south toward Broken Rock, the desert stretched endlessly before them. But for the first time in months, Margaret wasn't seeing it as a place of death and abandonment. She was seeing it as a place of possibility. Behind them, the wind scattered the ashes of their fire, erasing the last traces of their refuge. Ahead lay danger, uncertainty, and the slim hope of finding one lost Apache girl in a territory vast as an ocean. But they were no longer alone, and sometimes that was enough to make even the impossible seem worth attempting. Chapter 6. The Promise of Tomorrow. 3 months later, Margaret stood in the trading post of Broken Rock, her heart pounding as she played the role of her life. The settlement was everything she'd expected and worse. A collection of rough buildings thrown together by men who'd turned their backs on civilization, where human suffering was just another commodity to be bought and sold. Carlson was a thick-set man with cold eyes and hands that never stopped moving, counting money or fingering weapons. He examined Margaret with the detached interest of someone appraising livestock. "She's in good condition," he said to Ayana, who stood behind her with carefully controlled tension. "Educated, you said, can read and write." "Yes," Ayana replied, his English deliberately broken. "Good for keeping books, worth much." Margaret forced herself to remain still, to play the part of a resigned captive while her mind raced. They'd been in Broken Rock for 2 days, carefully gathering information. Carlson's operation was larger than they'd imagined. He had connections stretching from California to Texas, a network of traders who moved human cargo like any other merchandise. And yesterday, they'd gotten the break they'd been hoping for. "I had an Apache girl," Carlson mused, still studying Margaret. "Pretty thing, about 18. Sold her to a rancher in California last year. Paid good money for her, too." Margaret's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. "What did she look like?" she asked quietly, as if making conversation. Carlson's eyes sharpened. "You speak? Good. Makes you worth more." He considered her question. Small, delicate features, had these unusual green eyes, made her exotic. Why? Behind her, Margaret felt Ayana's tension like a physical force. Green eyes were rare among the Apache, but Ayana had mentioned that his sister had inherited them from a great-grandmother who had been captured by the Spanish generations ago. "Just curious," Margaret said. "I knew some Apache women back east." That night, in the small room they'd rented above the saloon, Margaret and Ayana sat in tense silence. They'd found their first real lead, but it came with terrible implications. "California," Ayana said finally, his voice hollow. "She could be anywhere in California." "But we have a name," Margaret reminded him. "Carlson mentioned a rancher, someone who paid well for her." "That narrows it down. To what? 1,000 ranches? 10,000? Margaret reached across the small table and took his hand, feeling the calluses earned from years of survival. "We'll find her, Ayana. We'll find a way." He looked at her then, and she saw something she hadn't expected, gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why are you doing this? Really?" Margaret considered the question, thinking of all the easy answers she could give. Because it was right. Because she owed him her life. Because she had nothing else to live for. But sitting there in that rough room, looking into the eyes of the man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, she realized the truth was simpler and more complex than any of those reasons. "Because for the first time since Thomas died, I feel alive," she said. "Because when I'm with you, I remember who I used to be, and I can imagine who I might become. Because your sister deserves to be found, and your family deserves to know what happened to her." She paused, gathering courage for the rest. "And because I love you. Not the grateful love of someone who's been rescued, but the real love of someone who's found their match in the most unlikely place." Ayana's eyes widened, and for a moment Margaret thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Then he smiled, the first truly joyful expression she'd seen from him. "I love you too," he said simply. "I think I have, since the day I found you in the desert. You were so broken, so lost, but you were still fighting. Still holding onto that little cross, like it was the only thing keeping you in this world." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a piece of turquoise carved into the shape of a bird, strung on a leather cord. "This was Njoni's," he said, placing it carefully on the table between them. "She made it when she was 12, gave it to me for protection. I've carried it ever since she was taken." Margaret looked at the carving, seeing the careful work of young hands, the love that had shaped it. "And now? Now I want you to have it," Ayana said. "Not because I'm giving up on finding her, but because I've found something else worth protecting, someone else worth fighting for." Margaret took the cord and slipped it over her head, feeling the weight of the turquoise against her chest next to Thomas's cross. Past and present, loss and hope, the end of one story and the beginning of another. Outside, the desert wind howled through the settlement, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain. Tomorrow, they would begin the long journey to California, following a trail that might lead to nothing but more heartbreak. But tonight, in this rough room above a saloon in a settlement that existed on the edges of civilization, two broken souls had found something worth more than gold. They had found each other, and in finding each other, they had found the strength to keep searching for the ones they'd lost. Margaret reached across the table and took Ayanna's hand, feeling the warmth of his skin, the steady pulse of his blood. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, and sometimes that was enough to make even the impossible seem possible. End of Chapter 6. The end. Author's note. This story explores themes of survival, cultural collision, and the healing power of human connection against the backdrop of the American frontier. Set in the Oregon Territory during the 1850s, it portrays the complex realities of westward expansion while focusing on the deeply personal journey of two individuals who find hope and purpose in each other despite the prejudices and violence of their time.